it's kind of sparse up here today, so.
Yeah, but I'm used to seeing somebody sitting on the other end, and I know which seat to sit in. It ain't working now.
Brother Clunt sent out, in an email, he sent the bulletin out. We just need to keep track, keep in mind all of those that are on the sick list. Also, pray for Brother or Sister Blackman's safe return home today. She'll be. Dave, you taking her to the airport too, or is that somebody you taking her to? So Dave will make sure she gets to the airport, and then everybody from there. Brother Mike Curley, would you lead us in a prayer, please, before we begin?
Dear God in heaven, we thank you for this time to come here to listen to thy word, and we take these words that have been given to us from the Bible that you have given us, and we take those words and put them in our everyday life. May you bless those that this morning. May you watch over them and heal them. And bless those that were hindered from service this morning. May you touch their lives that they may look back and be back with us another time. And Father, we thank you for the day that is upon us here. May we have a good day here to worship thee. May we do those things that will be appropriate in thy sight, pleasing with thee. Bless Larry as he brings a lesson to us today, and as those things may be available to bring to us. And Father, we ask you to forgive so many sins. In Christ's name.
Thank you. Today's lesson is supposed to be about the evolution of man, but if you recall, I said I jumped the gun a couple of weeks ago when we was talking about evolution, and I had brought in man, and we had more or less concentrated on that. So today I'm going to back up just a little bit and cover some other things, and we will mention evolution of man in a little bit different category today. But the first thing is this chart up here that most of you can barely see because it's so small and so much information. It really goes back to, on the screen it says 4,000, but that is in millions of years. So 4,000 million is actually, they're looking at 4 billion years ago. So that's where everything starts. Now, according to science, the earliest undisputed form of life starts at the very beginning there, right about 4 billion years ago, and it was a form of algae. It's called a stromatolite. It's basically a layered moss type blue-green algae. And now Darwin's theory of evolution that we had talked about a couple of weeks ago began in the late 1800s when he had published his book, The Origin of the Species. And he basically is concentrating with how each living species or kind evolved from something else. So he is talking about living. Now I want to show you two videos that they're about 12 minutes in total length. It's some very good information, and then we'll go from there. The first one is the longest section, and
Evolution to that assumption. Why is time such an important element to evolution? Ron Carter is a marine biologist, so he took me scuba diving to get a glimpse of a world most people don't see. His specialty was coral, and he knew a lot about the incredible creatures that inhabit the reef around St. Thomas.
fossil record, which indicates very strongly that these are actually different creations.
So we don't get one kind becoming another kind.
No. Evolutionary theory requires that small, random changes can explain everything we see,
Mhm.
but it can't.
And why can't it?
Because life is so complex that small changes can't explain it. Just like you can't take a computer operating system
Mhm.
and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is built up one digit at a time over any length of time. No, it took an intelligent person to sit down and put it together.
Well, I can guarantee you, as one who's in that world, that if anyone in the area of computer science were to say, if we just randomly change some things in this operating system, it'll get better. I mean, no one would agree with that.
No, we're not going to get the shark to evolve into Earth. The number of changes and the types of changes are not something that you can do one change at a time. This is a sea urchin.
Looks spiny.
It's pointy, you gotta be careful.
My head gets stuck like that.
He's pointy, but
Oh my goodness, they're moving.
yes, they're moving. And in between the spines are little tube feet, especially on the bottom. Oh, look at that movement. So he walks with his spines, but he's little tube feet in here, and that's what he uses to grab onto things. But looking carefully, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are actually 10 radial parts to this animal. Actually, the starfish is his cousin.
Are you serious? You can't be serious.
Absolutely. Starfish here is also an echinoderm, but notice he has fivefold symmetry instead of 10.
Yeah?
This starfish does. On the bottom, look. We see the spines, we see the 2 feet. His mouth is in the center there.
So there is some similarity here, even though externally it looks a lot different.
A lot different, actually. You want to see something that looks a lot different? Which is a cousin to the starfish and the sea urchin?
Right. It almost looks like a rock.
Yes, yes, I gotta be careful he's squirting on me. This is a sea cucumber. He has spines. He has 2 feet. Oh my goodness. You never know it until you study it really hard that this also is an echinoderm. He's not very happy being out of the water, so let me put him back in.
Yes, so these are all related, even though they look very, very different.
Related in their creation. Not in an evolutionary sense, but our creator took this phylum of life, the echinoderms, and created this and this and this on a similar pattern. So that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they share most of their genes in common, but they're developmental genes. They're called Hox genes that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops. They develop from a single cell. And in one of them, they set up a fivefold symmetry. Another, they set up a tenfold symmetry. Another one, they made this long, skinny animal. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So what you're saying, when we look at
Now, to go back to the very beginning, this chart up here, like I said, goes back to 4 billion years ago. And the first thing is abiogenesis. If you look at it, when this earth was formed, there was nothing living. And abiogenesis means that life comes from non-life. Now, the first person to come up with this theory was a fellow by the name of Owen. Let me get my, in 1924, he was a Russian biochemist, and he proposed that living cells arose gradually from non-living matter through a sequence of chemical reactions. And according to him, the gases present in the atmosphere at the time had some kind of energy charge, like an electrical charge or something like that, that then created amino acids. And according to his words, when induced by lightning or other sources of energy, would react to form simple organic compounds. These compounds would subsequently self-assemble into increasingly complex molecules such as proteins. These in turn would organize themselves into living cells. Now, the information I get this from is the Weizmann Institute of Science. So, according to him, the original evolution of life came from inorganic matter. Now, if we drop the letter A from that, we have the word biogenesis. Now, every scientist, whether they're a theorist or an atheist, understands that the natural laws that, and I'm going to read this one also, biogenesis, this law simply says that in nature, life comes only from previous life of its own kind. Over the years, the truthfulness of this law has been documented by thousands of scientists. So if you go back to the film that we saw, what that fellow said was that everything stays within its kind. They adapt various things, but they stay within their own kind. There was an evolutionist by the name of George Wald, and he wrote an article in 1954. He was also an atheist, but he said that the origins, he wrote a book called, the article was titled, The Origin of Life. And he said there were ultimately two options for life's origin. One was spontaneous generation, which was the abiogenesis that we looked at. Something came from nothing. And then he said the second choice is supernatural creation. And his definition of supernatural creation is that to believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation. And then he went on to say, there is no third position. So things either had to start from nothing, or they had to be created by a designer, and this is from an atheist. Now, like I said, this was written in 1954. Currently, there is a third option out there that he was not aware of. Recently, they are starting to say that, how many of you have heard the term panspermia? Panspermia. That means that some kind of life has traveled to this earth on meteorites. It's life out there that has gotten to here. But then we pick up with the evolution of things. But if that be true, which it's not, but if that be true, where did that life begin? It had to start somewhere. Did it start with the original nothing to something, or was it created? So sort of in a circle, we get right back to the point where this fella is correct, even though he didn't know about that third option in there, because life has to start somewhere. But sadly, most biologists are unwilling to accept the alternate belief in special creation. In 2007, Anthony Flew, who for 5 decades was the world's leading atheist thinker, was forced in the end to conclude the only satisfactory explanation for the origin of such indirected, self-replicating life as we see on earth is an infinitely intelligent mind. Won't say God, but there is an infinitely intelligent mind out there that had to create all this, and that is, like I say, from an atheist. So, if you will look at Psalms 147, verse 5, 147, verse 5. Great is our Lord, and of great power. His understanding is infinite. Like I say, this fellow wouldn't call him God, but that's got to be the reference that he was referencing, the infinite mind. The Bible in Genesis 1 and chapters 1 and 2 give us the specific order in which God, the infinite intelligent mind, created all things. Now, in my opinion, we've used science to prove how the world got here by the Bible. We've proven how man developed by the Bible. What we're going to go into now, since I've jumped the gun a couple of weeks ago and discounted all the transitions from ape to man and went through the evolution of man, I want to go into another category that is often overlooked when we talk about man and evolution, and this has to do with his intelligence, or where the mind come in and how things developed. If you recall your history when you was in school, they talked about the Stone Age, and then they went to the Bronze Age, and then they went up to the Iron Age. Well, according to the scientists and the way things are, and KJ, I see you nodding your head this way. You've been studying this, right? The Stone Age began somewhere around 2.5 million years ago, and then it all the way up until about 3,000. They say 8,000, but then they've got a period of time in between that we'll cover from stone to bronze. But the name Stone Age actually comes from how they created and used weapons and tools. Now, the 3 periods that they want to put in there, the first was the Paleolithic, then the Mesozoic, and then the Neolithic, and we'll cover those very briefly. But if you really want to look at it, and where I sort of go off the main path with this is, if you look at science, they want to say Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Well, when Columbus, he wasn't the first, the Vikings were the first. Again, this is where history tells us a little bit wrong, but when man was first introduced to the American continent, what kind of weapons did they have? They had iron, they had tools made out of iron, right? Bronze. What was the Native American using? Wood, stone. So here we've got, to me, what they need to do instead of trying to say Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, is look at the culture, what the culture is using. And that's where I want to go along with this, because we get to a certain point here when we get into that Neolithic period where it starts to congeal and science and the Bible start to agree. It's only at the very beginning where science and the Bible on the timeline disagree. But they say that in the Stone Age, that the humanoids were hunter-gatherers. What does the Bible tell us? We'll get to that in just a few minutes. So from 8,000 back was basically, as I said, the Mesolithic period was the middle period, which covered from about 8,000 back to about 100,000 or so. I was reading an article this morning that said that they have found the oldest so-called human footprint was in this area, and they said it has shown us that people were using modern apparel much earlier than we thought. The footprint that they found had on a hard-sole sandal, and they date it to this Mesolithic period. They want to go back into the 50 or 60 million years ago period. Were they wrong that the people were wearing hard-sole sandals that long ago? Or are they just wrong in their dating? I think they're wrong in their dating process. But during the Neolithic period, which covers in between this 8,000 and the Bronze Age, which starts about the 3,000 year period of time, and they call it the Neolithic because then they started, instead of being wanderers, they started living in groups. They started herd animals, and they started gardening a little bit. But if we go into start comparing the book of Genesis to this, looking in the Neolithic period, going back to some of the earlier classes, we said that, and according to this chart up here, that creation, using the Bible as the counting system, started somewhere around 4,100 years BC, roughly 6,100 years ago. So the Bronze Age starts at 3,000, so that's just where we're starting to overlap just a little bit. But when you go to Genesis 1 and verse 29, it says, "And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat." Meat here means food, doesn't mean meat like we think of meat. It's food. So, in the Stone Age, they said that they were hunter-gatherers. What does the Bible say? There were no hunters. They wasn't meat eaters at this time. Yes, sir.
That was a universal statement that the food would be plant life or whatever, not meat.
For man and all the animals, it was everything was vegetarian, which gets to my next point in Genesis 9:3. In Genesis 9:3, which is roughly, well, by count, it's 1,656 years after creation. We're going to approximate about 1,650 years after creation. When man came off the ark, when Noah and they came off the ark, Genesis 9:3 says, "Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, food. Even as the green herb have I given you all things." So, if you use these two verses in the Bible, everything was vegetarian, herbivore, from creation to getting off the boat. Then things changed. They went from herbivore to carnivore and omnivore and herbivore. They went to all three of those. And again, if you look, how long did people live during the antediluvian period, pre-flood period? 5, 6, 7, 8, 900 years. In Genesis chapter 6, at the very beginning, it says man's days will be 120 years. Okay? Now we're getting down to 120 years. How long did Moses live? 120 years. How long did Joseph live? 110 years. So after the flood, time span dropped off. Man starts living more what we consider normal lifespans than they did pre-flood. The climate changed, food source changed, everything changed from pre-flood to after flood. Now, in Genesis 3, backing up to Genesis 3 and verse 17, it says, "And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, and sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." So even after Adam and Eve was kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they were still to eat from the fruit of the ground. No hunter-gatherer involved. Maybe gathering, but no hunter involved. Then if you will look at Genesis 4 and verse 22, "And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." So from the very first people, Cain being the oldest, recorded, they were tillers of the ground. They were farmers, and they were sheep herders. They were not roaming around doing things like they said was happening in the Stone Age. Yes, sir? Nomads. No nomads. So the next stage that we get to then is the Bronze Age, which starts about 3000 to roughly 1200. So it is possible that Cain was tilling the ground with wooden implements. People even do that today in certain parts of the world. But he was at least tilling the ground. Now the name Bronze Age basically comes from the weapons, the weapons and tools that they made. And as I say, we have to look how culture is involved, what is being made culturally throughout the world. But bronze being an alloy means that it takes somebody with some intelligence to put things together. Andrea often asks me, how did they know to do this? Well, I go back to when God created man. What was the first thing that Adam was instructed to do?
Keep the garden.
Prior to that? Name the animal. How was he going to name all those animals if he did not have a brain to be able to conceptualize what they look like and put a name to them? And when Eve came around, how did they communicate? God spoke to them. How did they know how to communicate? God instructed them. So from at the very beginning, God set things in motion, gave them the intelligence to do things, the ability to do things, and bronze is a mix of copper and tin in the right proportions. And if we will then look at Genesis 4 and verse 22, it says, "And Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain." Now look at this closely. "And Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naaman." Now, we can go down a rabbit trail here because Naaman is only mentioned here, and according to some rabbis, this was actually Moses' wife. I'm just telling you what I've been reading. But what I'm trying to put all this together to say is when we get to Genesis 4 and verse 22, we have moved from the Garden of Eden getting really, really close to when the flood is about to take place. So somewhere just before the flood is Tubal-Cain. And the flood happened somewhere around 2,550 or so years BC. So it's within the Bronze Age, but it's at the very beginning of the Bronze Age. And like I say, this is where things start sort of congealing and tying together with science and what man is doing. However, if he was a worker in iron, the Iron Age doesn't come around for a few more years, a few hundred more years. So, worker of brass, worker of iron, and the Iron Age doesn't start until 1200 BC. So he's 800 or so years ahead of his time there. The Iron Age is from 1200 to 550 BC, roughly. And again, it's because of the weapons and the instruments changing. Now, this period of time saw new forms of transportation. We'll get into those just a little bit here in just a minute. But in Numbers 35 and verse 16, and if he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die, he is a murderer. Weapon, iron. When was Numbers? Numbers was before the bondage period. And when did the bondage period take place? A few hundred years after the flood. So we're still in the before the Iron Age should exist time, because the Exodus, my best study of Exodus comes up to the Exodus being 1450 BC, give or take a year. Most people want to put it in the period of time of Ramesses, which is getting into the 1250s. But I think if you really, really study it, you go back to the 1450s. So if we go back another 400 years for the bondage period, then we're looking at about 1,800 years. So we're 600-700 years before the Iron Age, but yet in Numbers we're talking about if you kill somebody with iron. Also in Deuteronomy 3 and verse 11, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Again, iron predating the bondage period in Egypt, predating 1800 BC, 1800 years ago. Deuteronomy 27:5, and there shalt thou build an altar unto the Lord thy God, an altar of stone. Thou shalt not lift up any iron tools upon them. Again, iron predating the Iron Age. And then in Joshua, we're still before, we're just now going into the land of Canaan. And the children of Joseph said, the hill is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites that dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both they who are of Bashan and her towns, and they who are of the valley of Jezreel. So, as we can see the human development come into place, not just the evolution of man, but the evolution of man's civilization, tools, and things like that, the closer we get to modern time, the more they start coming together. But the Bible and science disagree on the earlier dates and stages of the development of these instruments. That probably wasn't the direction y'all thought we would go today, but anybody have any questions on anything that we have covered from the beginning of this series up to this point? The evolution of the earth, man, people, animals, dinosaurs. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, sir.
God didn't leave mankind by themselves mentally, because as they populated, then they became more sophisticated. There was intelligence from the very beginning.
Yeah.
If eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil gave them some intelligence to do things. Because if it didn't work that way, then why would they be able to do on their own from the very beginning?
Yes, sir. Now, if we go back to that film and look at it where they showed the Neanderthal and they said, that's human, that's one of us, even though it's different than what others are. If you just look in this audience, how different each of us are. There's not two of us in here that are alike. So, if you go back to when the ark settled on the mountains of Ararat, basically somewhere around Turkey, when the population started growing and expanding, everything came about from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And if you look at those three, now prior to the flood, there was also a dispersion of people that was scattering around, moving around. Cain was cast out, went back. So there are people who, based on the area that they go to and live in, they adapt to those areas. Well, after the flood, the same thing took place. And if you take Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the lineage of Shem basically stayed in the Middle East. Japheth, that group went north into the European area. And Ham's group, as they migrated, they went down into the region of Ethiopia and Africa. So that's how the three branches of the family started migrating. And of course, within that, then, I've got relatives that up in North Alabama that lives so far back in some of the hills up around Scottsboro that you have to pipe in sunshine. They're different than the city dwellers. So that to me is the whole point of it, that God created man, and as the scientist there said, within each kind, God gave them the ability to adapt, to change and adapt in certain ways, but they are still man. There is no, you may want to claim it. I did not come from a monkey or an ape. And I don't think any of you did. If you want to claim it, that's up to you. But
I've seen some people who acted like it.
well, as I mentioned about 3 weeks ago, I heard the bell ring, but as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, there's some folks living right here in Millbrook, Alabama, and if you take a real close look at them and stand a picture of a Neanderthal up, you're going to say they're first cousins. So thank y'all so much for your attention.